Today on The State of Us, what is happening with the LGBTQ culture wars? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the friendly redneck liberal, senior resident historian, and an educator of more than 35 years, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're looking at how to make sense of the new LGBTQ culture war. So we're going to look at what is taking place right now with the LGBTQ community, a deeper understanding of sort of the first three interpretations of current statistics that seem to be most common. But before we dive in, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
We do. The word is prehension, 3 syllables, a noun, prehension, prehension, and it means the act of seizing or grasping.
Yes, well, our audience have the capacity for prehension with the topics that we're going to dive into. I guess the thing to start out with, right, is we want our audience to know that it's okay to not understand everything that we say, and it's okay to disagree with what we think. That is, I think, part of the purpose of our show. So if we say something that you want further explanation on, or that you disagree with, or if you agree with it, there's a great way to tell us. You can send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, because we would like to hear your thoughts. But I do think that this is an opportunity for us to break down some things and hopefully bring people a better understanding of what's going on. So let's begin with a recent Gallup poll. So the share of younger Americans who identify right now as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender has risen precipitously in the last decade. Almost 21% of Gen Z, meaning for the purposes of the survey, young adults who were born between 1997 and 2003, identify as LGBT, as against about 10% of the millennial generation, just over 4% of Gen X, and less than 3% of baby boomers. Comparing the Gen Z to baby boom generation, the percentage of people identifying as transgender in particular has risen 20-fold. Now, the way that we're discussing this today is based off of this article, which is linked at thestateofus.org. So if you want to read it for yourself, you're welcome to. And basically, the author's contention is that there are 3 interpretations to this data. Okay, and we're going to talk about each one. The first interpretation is, this is great news. The second interpretation is, we shouldn't read too much into it. And the third interpretation is, this trend is bad news.
I don't want to be nitpicky, okay?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to get us off track, because we have some really good things to talk about. But since when is a generation 6 years long?
Well, I think the reason for that is because if you were born after 2003, you would still be Gen Z, but you wouldn't be an adult yet.
You wouldn't be identifying yet, or that's not true too.
You wouldn't be a legal adult who could answer the survey. I think that's
okay.
The reasoning.
Very good, thank you. Please
be my guess.
Please continue.
Okay. They don't explain that, but my guess is they didn't survey anybody under the age of 18, so therefore they stopped at 2003. So the stats may be different if you actually included more of Gen Z, which would probably span all the way down to those that are, 14 or 13 today, something like that, depending on, how they end up deciding to define this generation. So the first interpretation, this is great news, right? Well, let's talk about that one. The author contends the following. Basically, the author doesn't contend this. The author says this is the contention of this interpretation, okay? Sexual fluidity, transgender, and non-binary experience are clearly intrinsic to the human experience. Our society used to suppress them with punitive heteronormativity, and only now are we getting a true picture of the real diversity of sexual attractions and gender identities. Just as, for example, we discovered that left-handedness is much more common once we stopped trying to train kids out of it. So the response from society should be sustained encouragement, especially if you care about teenage mental health. This newly awakened diversity should be supported from the time it first makes It's self-manifest at however young an age to the extent that parents feel uncomfortable with their child's true selves. It's the task of educators and schools to support the kid, not to defer to parental anxiety or bigotry.
Well, see, but why do you have to put that caveat on there? I agree with everything you read. Then why does it have to be great news? Why can't it just be news? Because if you say great news, now all of a sudden you're going to get people who don't like this to say, no, it's not great news. You've already created an antagonistic idea, because what you just said was, hey, we should just represent and encourage people to be people, because that's what it's all about. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Are we creating a problem when we say this is great news, this is bad news? And I'm not attacking you because that's what the author says, you know?
Yeah, I'm just reading.
You're just reading it. But my point is, I agree with everything you said. Shouldn't we just encourage people to be people and to be who they are?
The second interpretation, we shouldn't read too much into it. Again, referring back to those statistics about the increase in those identifying as part of the LGBT community. The author goes on to explain this second interpretation as this trend is probably mostly just young people being young people, exploring and experimenting and differentiating themselves from their elders. Most of the Generation Zers identifying as LGBT are calling themselves bisexual and will probably end up in straight relationships if they aren't already in them. Some of the young adults describing themselves as transgender or non-binary may drift back to cisgender identities as they grow older. So we shouldn't freak out over their self-identification, but neither should we treat it as a definitive revelation about human nature or try to build new curriculums or impose certain rules atop a fluid and uncertain situation. Tolerance is essential. Ideological enthusiasm is unnecessary.
Yes, because that's teenagers, right? Teenagers have always rebelled against the status quo. That's what being a teenager means. You question authority. You question what has been put before you. And at least in my study of history, the majority then fall into whatever the norms of society are.
The third interpretation, this trend is bad news. What we're seeing today isn't just a continuation of the gay rights revolution. It's a form of social contagion, which our educational and medical institutions are encouraging and accelerating. These kids aren't setting themselves free from the patriarchy. They're under the influence of online communities of imitation and academic fashions laundered into psychiatry and education. One part Tumblr and TikTok memes, one part Judith Butler. There is no clear evidence that any of this is making kids happier or better adjusted. Instead, all we see is a worsening of teen mental health, blurring into a young adult landscape where sex and relationships and marriage are on the wane. So what we need now is probably more emphasis on biology, normativity, and reconciliation with our own maleness or femaleness, not further deconstruction.
Okay, none of these really are attacking the existence of this. They're arguing how it should be dealt with. Correct? Because even the last one, it's bad news because it's being exacerbated by the idea that social media is controlling this, and social media is not good for the mental health of young people, which we've said on multiple occasions on this show. Am I reading something different in there than what the author wants to try to purvey by dividing this issue up into three parts, which if you read the entire article, that's what they're doing. They're not necessarily advocating for one of the three. They're saying these are the three different schools of thought. So if there are three different schools of thought, isn't there some validity to each point?
Well, that is what we're endeavoring to talk about today, right? Is what to make of these camps. The thing though, Lance, that I think is key, like as we go to discuss the possibility of what if there's truth in all of them, is that I'm not sure that most people view it that way. I would imagine that many people listening, now, hopefully I'm wrong about this. I hope that most of our listeners listening feel like they listen to all three of those and say, you know, maybe I don't even agree with the majority of each, but I think there's truth in each thing, you know, or I think there's things that are important in each thing. However, I think that the author's contention is that most people feel themselves primarily to exist
in one camp or the other,
in one of those three areas.
Okay.
Either they're on the side of, we shouldn't question this at all. It's tremendous that society is becoming more open and accepting, and there's probably always been this percentage of people that feel this way, and so we have to embrace it without question and encourage it. And then there's that middle ground that's more, it is becoming more acceptable, but therefore young people have always experimented and have always questioned who they are to some extent. And this is just modern society doing the same thing. So there are going to be kids who, question or identify differently, who may later in life not identify that way. And that doesn't mean there will be ones who don't genuinely figure it out in their teen years and stay that way their whole life. It doesn't mean, in other words, don't read too much into it. I think it's a good consensus of, we can't take a lot from it yet because it just there hasn't been enough time to really decide. So we don't necessarily want to push really hard on it, but we also don't want to contract from it. We want to be supportive and see where it goes. Be tolerant, I think, is the way that second contention. And then the third camp is, this is concerning. The fact that, we have kids who are very uncertain, mental health crisis is on the rise, and this may actually be attributed to causing problems with mental health. While it's also, we see kids who are taking hormone blockers or puberty blockers, or who are transitioning, and that is bad. Now there are people, I would imagine, in the third camp who don't ever want to see anybody transition or take those, but there are also those who would be in the third camp who would say, we just don't want kids to do that. If they become an adult and they want to do that, I may not agree with them, but that's their business. So the third, all of the camps, right? That's the problem with any camps, and the author says this, is they're broad generalizations, because there's a lot of people that you could probably lump into one of those groups who have differing opinions in that group. But for the purposes of discussion, saying here's kind of generally, you can separate, most people into feeling mostly one of these three things. Or if you're Lance Jackson, feel like some level of truth resides in all of them. So let's talk about what to make of this, and then where to go from here. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The author continues by saying, titling this An Unusual Coalition. If these are general contours of the new culture war, however, there are also three important complications. The first is that the third camp that was just described, the camp that is intensely worried about these trends, is conservative at its core, but much more diverse at its peripheries. And what does that mean? Well, what it means is, and this is something that's been, for those that aren't aware, has been sort of rumbling around in the LGBTQ plus community, which is this question of whether or not the umbrella has maybe gotten too big. Now, I want to be clear that I am not necessarily contending this. I'm merely just trying to relay something that I know to be a reality of the community, and something that I have questioned as a member of the community. Is you have a community, and I'm going to try to keep this as simple for people as possible, that involves a number of different things, but there's two, I think, very clear sort of subsets, right? There is sexual orientation. That is, who are you romantically, sexually, emotionally attracted to? Okay. There is that. And then there is gender identity, okay? And that would be, again, very, very simply put, because the different people would define this differently, what gender, right, male, female, or something else, do you identify as? And those are not mutually exclusive ideas, right? They are distinct, and also, while there is certainly overlap in the challenges and obstacles that people in those two groups face, right? Those dealing with gender identity and those dealing with sexual orientation, while, for example, as somebody who does not deal with gender identity, right? I don't question my gender. I don't think I've ever seriously questioned it. I mean, not any more than I think anybody else has. I've always felt like I have been male. I feel like I am male, right? I don't feel like I, was born the wrong gender. I don't feel that way, right? I don't feel like my biology doesn't match what I feel inside. So I don't understand that component of it, right? I mean, logically I can understand it, but I don't experience that. On the other hand, though, I do fall into the sexual orientation camp, right? And so I do understand the plight that people in that side of the community go through, have experienced some of that, right, myself. So I get that. At the same time, both groups, right, are familiar with, broadly speaking, being treated differently and here's, how do you describe this? Being different than the majority of society. Okay. I was going to say not normal, but, different than the majority of society. Most people in society, right? Most people are straight, and most people identify as the gender that they were born as. So that means this group over here is not in the majority. They are a minority group, particularly when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. However, the issues they also face, and this is where I think this is part of this, the complication of the culture wars, is not just what straight people think and what everybody else thinks who's not straight. It's also inside of the LGBT community, what people who are transgender are advocating for and what they need are not always the same as what people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual are advocating for. And I know that may seem like a technicality, but I really think that it is part of the challenge. The conversation we're having, Lance, I don't think most people are having this conversation with kids. And I don't think that most children understand any of this. And whether it was this or any other issue, I think then the problem becomes they are left to try to figure it out for themselves. So when you ask me which of these camps I'm in, I honestly see probably the most truth in the second interpretation, not for the reason that most people think. The reason I don't think we can read too much into it is because I don't think that we're equipping young people with the ability to make any informed decisions on this. I don't think most of them are being given the opportunity to really understand any of this. They're having feelings, they're questioning things. And so, no, we can't read too much into the data because I don't, just personally, the ones that I've worked with, like at the youth center who have these questions, a lot of times they don't understand what they're saying, right? They don't really understand what they're saying. And that doesn't mean that they don't feel things that they have questions about. All it means is that there's no one for them to ask, right? Or the people they do ask, they don't know because they're not educated and they don't understand, so they don't have any better answers. So I guess, I don't know, Lance, there's the rant on, I guess I boil it down to saying that while, yes, there are the issues of everybody that's not part of the LGBT community, right? And how they view the community and these trends. There's also the community itself and what we have to consider in what is our role and what are we doing to play into or not in helping people better understand, better respect the differences and challenges that each group face. And not just when you lump it all together, my fear, right, is that people just refer to it as the community and there's the nuance is lost. And then for young people, when they're trying to figure out who they are, it makes it very difficult for them to come to conclusions of any kind that they can be confident in, partly because they really don't know any of it. And there isn't anybody to talk to because most people don't know.
Well, I'm being very reflective, but I think it's time that, okay, I think that's true about any group, is that we had a saying back around 2000s. It was big in the public schools, don't put people in a box, right? Because we're all made up of a lot of divergent ideas and thoughts. And to say, I listen to country music and I drive a pickup truck, then I'm X, right? And we do that with people because, well, it's easier to understand for me, the euphemistic me, to understand if everybody who listens to country music and drives a truck is a social conservative, and everybody who listens to rock and roll must smoke weed. And because then, okay, now I can start to understand, because everybody's, but wow, you give me that guy, you give me this guy who listens to country music and rock and roll and drives a pickup truck, who wears bow ties and Converse tennis shoes to work in every day, and then likes a little bit of opera and musicals. Well, what do we do with him? What do we do with that person? Because my God, I'm describing me, right? I'm in a bunch of different camps, and I don't think it's that big of a deal when you say, well, yeah, there are differences because we're all different as humans, which is why I don't understand. And again, I said this off air and Justin laughed at me. I do understand logically, but I don't understand what the big deal is. Why can't we just all be people and do what we want to do? Why can't I go where I want to go and be where I want to go and be with people? And because there are people in both camps who would not want me around. There are people who don't want me at their private country club. And there are probably people within the community, as you talk about, who would be offended or upset if I walked in with my wife to their place, or a place that they thought was theirs for their community. Why do we have to separate? I understand why. I know why, because people will be mean and but that's what bothers me. Okay. Is that I just want to get along with everybody and understand things. And the final point that I'll make, and then you can tear me up or support me or whatever, is that what I'm relating to your community talk is the idea that I think back to the civil rights movement, something that I've studied quite a lot about when I was getting my master's degree. And there was that break, right? There was Martin Luther King Jr. And then the young people thought that King was not proactive enough, that he was waiting to, and so they formed SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they became much more in your face and said, we want our rights now, and we don't have time to wait because our lives, we need this. And they started to do more violent things. And then you have the third group out there within the umbrella of civil rights. You had the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and those guys who said, no, we're going to do this, but yet who funded, community gardens and made sure kids were fed before they went to school and did a lot of good things. But they were like, no, we are going to force our way into society. So you have this umbrella of civil rights, but you had three distinct camps about how it should be approached and three different ideas on what needed to be done. I liken that, whether I'm right or not. I kind of, as I was reflecting when you were talking, I likened your description of within the LGBTQ plus community that there are different ideas and different people who have different goals and who have different needs and who have different wants for what they would like society to do and adapt.
What does Justin think about what Lance said? Well, to find out, you'll have to keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Why can't we be friends? Why can't we be friends? Well, maybe we don't even need to be friends. Maybe we just need to be, okay.
Accepting of others.
Okay with other people.
Be accepting of others, okay? And their beliefs and their lifestyles, because you know what? It doesn't affect you. You're okay, all right? You're just okay. You don't have to be scared of things you don't understand. I think the number of people out there who really want to do harm to others is a very small number. I know they get a lot of press, but I think most of us really don't want to hurt other people, but we don't understand them. So therefore we do things that hurt them.
I think what it comes down to is I think people want to feel a sense of belonging and they want to feel understood. And that's, I think, all people, now what that means for everybody is very different, right? And that's part of wherein lies this challenge. The other side of that is that some people are going to feel their belonging or their opportunity to fit in as threatened by somebody else's existence. Doesn't mean it's right. Don't think that it is. But I think that's part of what leads to where we're at. To answer, or to, I guess not answer, but to respond to Lance's comments at the end of the second segment, in an ideal world, do I think that all of us being able to, get along together and do well is what we should strive for? Absolutely. I also have contended, though, and continue to do so, that I think our differences are part of what makes us all exceptional. And part of what is valuable about humans is that we come in many shapes and sizes and attractions. And when we bring more of those people to the table, we will come to better answers and solutions than if we act as if differences don't exist. At the same time, the problem is that most people are not good about respecting differences. Partly because it can be very frustrating. And personally, having gone through that, especially when I was coming to terms with my own sexuality, I struggled greatly with people who didn't understand. Me being tolerant and patient with them was very challenging. And there are plenty of people in the community who are not patient, because they don't feel they should have to be. And I guess let me say, no, you shouldn't have to be, right? We shouldn't have to be, but I think that we must if we want things to be better. And I think things are getting better. I was talking to Gen Z the other day, and their comment when talking about this issue was, what more legally does lesbians, gays, bisexuals, pansexuals, what legally more do they really need? Because, marriage equality and the Supreme Court decision a couple years ago now that says that sex also includes sexual orientation as part of the Civil Rights Act. So from an employment standpoint, you can't, discriminate directly on those basis. So what more do they need? And it was an odd moment for me, because in some ways it was like, what do you mean? Like, there's still mountains to climb. But for them, growing up and as they came to terms with their sexuality, that's how it's always been. No, it hasn't always been that way. When I, first met my husband, it wasn't even legal for us to get married in this state, but we are all subject to the realities we live in, right? And relative to us. So I think part of what's changing is younger generations are just generally, the Gen Z has grown up more with this, right? At the same time, I think they also are experiencing more confusion and uncertainty, partly because there's not as many people who can really help them navigate it in a way where they don't feel threatened. And that's both inside their generation specifically, and I think how other generations view them. And that goes back to our three camps of how people feel about this. Feel whatever you want. And I think The big thing, I guess, the approach that I've tried to take with them is answer the questions they have, and accept that they are young people and that what they feel today may not be what they feel tomorrow. But that doesn't, and here is the key that I think is so often missed, that does not diminish what they're feeling today. And I think that's the tendency of the reason that people aren't okay embracing that, well, whatever they feel today, we just accept that and that's what they will always feel. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes that's also not true. The problem is that then that camp that views this as bad uses that uncertainty to say, well, then you don't really feel that way. And what you feel right now doesn't matter because you won't always feel that way. And that, to me, when we talk about all of this, that's wherein lies the problem, is this, we either have to fully embrace it and say that this is how you are. And then in some ways that almost puts a pressure. It makes it harder for them to change their mind later because they feel like, well, this is what I've told everybody and that's what everybody thinks. And they said that's what I am. And so now I'm not comfortable saying something else. And then the other group is, well, you're young and you're going to change your mind. So what you say right now doesn't really matter. And I guess my feeling is that both sides are, we can respect what you feel right now without diminishing or restricting the possibility that you may feel differently in the future. I guess the example from my life is growing up, I didn't even know the term pansexuality existed, okay? I didn't even know that was a thing. So when I was thinking about who I was, and what best described me, bisexuality is what came to mind because as far as I really understood, there were only men and women. That's all there was, right? And I only was really familiar with gay, lesbian, and bisexual. I kind of got that. I sort of knew what transgender people were, but not really, not really. I didn't really understand what that was. In my, small-minded world, it was just people who transition sexually. That's what happens is they get surgeries done and change their sex. That's who transgender people are. And that was a obviously restricted, small-minded version of thinking about it, but that's what I came to the conclusion of. So the point is, though, as I learned more, I realized that, well, bisexuality may not be the most accurate description. And just because my knowledge base was limited doesn't mean that I should have limited myself as you grow and learn more.
Exactly. All I want to say is that's just the evolution of the discussion. When people say, well, I shouldn't have to, wait around for this. And you said, well, I only have this limited knowledge. And that's the evolution of the discussion that's taken place. That's the growth. Nothing just happens. It's not magical where, everybody's going to understand all of this. You have to have the discussions. It takes time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that when you are in a minority group, it takes time, but no, people who don't understand it aren't necessarily your enemies. They're people that haven't been exposed to the discussion yet, and they haven't been exposed to the ideas. And if you give them a chance and you listen to them and you explain to them, then they can become advocates within the discussion for your group, even if they're not a part of your group. And I think that's where I get really fired up. Is like, well, you just don't understand. Okay, you're right. Maybe I don't really understand, but if you teach me, then I can go out and teach others and I can help advocate for what it is you feel and what it is you want. And I can help others who are struggling with it. If you push me away and you don't include me in the discussion and you don't include me in the education of what you're feeling and what you need and what you want and what your frustrations are, then I don't feel like you can blame me for what I am. You have to educate me so that I can become a proponent for you. And if you don't have that level of acceptance, then I think you're hurting yourself and your own and that's just, and again, for what it's worth, okay? I think all of what you're talking about, someone who's older, I've watched this evolution of the process take place. Is it complete? No. Is it better than it was? Yes. Is the discussion good? It's fantastic. But we have to continue to talk. We can't shut each other out, because when you don't talk, you don't learn. And when you don't learn, you become fearful of those things you don't understand.
Hopefully that's what we're trying to do here on this program. As much as possible, I guess the thing that comes to mind is everybody, and this is mentioned in a different article, but don't assume bad intention. And it's so easy for us as people to do, because I think we are programmed, biologically to be on the lookout for danger, right? So there's an assumption that when people say something, and this is everybody, right? This is the LGBTQ community. This is people not in the community, that it is personal. What they're saying is personal and it's intentional. And I guess all I would say is that more often than not in my life, those things are rarely true. Rarely is somebody personally coming after you, and rarely is what is happening intentional. That doesn't make their actions more or less acceptable, but I think it does inform how we all choose to respond. The LGBT community having pride parades is not, most of them, a personal insult to the straight community, right? They are not out there trying to upset straight people and hurt them and make them feel unsafe, And when straight people say things that are not, fully accurate or are not as inclusive, it is rare that they are personally attacking one of us in the community and or trying to hurt us. It's rare. Doesn't mean that those situations I described don't exist, but I think as a matter of tolerance and moving toward getting along and figuring out what we want to do as a society, being patient and not jumping to the conclusion that everything is evil is helpful, even if I don't know if it's always true or not, but hopefully that's why we structure our conversations the way we do, right, Lance?
Yep. Here at True Chat, we have a mission. Our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. We've had one of those today. We thank you for listening. We hope that you share what we've done. I hope you go and read the articles and share your thoughts and views, not only with others, but even with us. And we've told you how you can do that. You can email us and we'll be glad to get back to you. And tell others. And if they too would like to start to listen and have these kinds of conversations with us and with you, tell them they can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the mornings. We're also heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. For the State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.